Step away from the cannon. You are not authorized to touch that weapon. The voice cut through the hangar dry-clipped, carrying the cold confidence of a young crew chief. The woman standing at the nose of the A-10 didn't turn around. Her hands kept moving slowly inside the GAU 8-barrel black oil smeared across her gloves, as if the order that had just been given didn't exist. "I'm talking to you, Airman." He stepped closer. In his eyes, there was only a familiar picture, grease-stained maintenance coveralls, a slender frame, hair pulled back tight. An airman out of place, someone who didn't belong here. "This is a restricted area. Show me your KAC. Where's your line badge? Who authorized you to work on this cannon?" The questions came down one after another, not seeking answers. She withdrew the cleaning rod from the barrel, wiped her hands on a rag, and stood upright. Still, she didn't say a word. Around them, the sound of metal slowed. A few hands froze mid-motion. People began to look their way. The air tightened thick and heavy. The crew chief gave a small smile, the smile of someone who believed he was in control. "Who do you think you are standing here, just another airman who doesn't know her place?" The woman remained still. No explanations, no arguments, no step backward. Only silence, heavy, unyielding, as if she had grown used to being erased from human worth a long time ago. And that silence was what began to change everything. If you believe that true courage doesn't live in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to veterans' legacy stories, so together we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our quiet heroes. She stood still. No arguments, no explanations, not a single unnecessary movement. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it was a familiar state, the silence of someone who had been pushed outside the boundaries of human worth too many times before. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead, neither avoiding nor challenging. They carried no questions. They carried certainty. Her hands were smeared with oil. Black stains pressed deep into every crease of her skin, not easily washed away. They were not marks of carelessness, but of real work, of real time, of long hours bent close to hot metal, where there are no spectators and no praise, only responsibility and consequences if you get it wrong. The cleaning rod was still in her hand. Straight, long, heavy, a simple tool, yet one that demanded patience and absolute precision. She didn't rush to put it away, not out of stubbornness, but because the job wasn't finished. For her, everything had to be completed fully. There was no such thing as good enough. The crew chief standing in front of her began to feel uneasy. This silence didn't resemble the fear he was used to seeing. It didn't tremble. It didn't fidget. It didn't seek permission. In that brief moment, he couldn't find a familiar reaction to latch onto. And for a young man accustomed to having his orders answered immediately, it felt like a quiet act of defiance. "Didn't you hear me?" The question came out sharper than necessary. His voice rose tighter now, not because his authority was being challenged, but because it wasn't being acknowledged. She didn't respond, not because she hadn't heard him, but because she had heard words like these far too many times throughout her military life. Questions that didn't require answers, orders aimed not at the mission, but at a person's place. Her gaze shifted slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. Not probing, not judging, just looking. The look of someone who had stood in situations where words no longer mattered. The look of someone who understood that silence is sometimes the only way to preserve dignity for both sides. Her confidence didn't come from visible rank, nor from anyone stepping in to defend her. It came from experience, from being overlooked, doubted, dismissed, and still completing the mission. From standing in places where no one asked who she was, only whether she could do the job. The crew chief began to lose patience. He shifted his stance, breathed harder. His hands clenched. In his mind, her silence had transformed into something else. No longer passive, but an attitude. A sign of disrespect toward authority. And for someone trying to assert his position in front of an audience that was unacceptable. Around them, the air changed almost imperceptibly. No one spoke. Yet eyes lingered longer. Hands slowed mid-task. Not out of curiosity, but because everyone sensed what was happening. This was no longer a routine reminder. It had become a quiet confrontation between two different understandings of power. For her, power meant carrying responsibility through to the end, even when no one was watching. For him, power meant orders executed immediately. The two did not meet, and her silence exposed the distance between them. She remained there. Steady eyes, oil-stained hands, the rod still in her grasp. No explanations, no gestures of submission, Not because she wanted to win, but because she had learned early on that the moment you begin to justify your right to exist, you lower your own worth to the level of doubt. And it was that silence, calm, familiar without pleading, that began to push the person standing before her to the edge of his limits. He drew in a deep breath, his eyes flicking toward her shoulder, as if searching for something, anything to hold on to. And then, he saw it. The crew chief smirked, his gaze sliding down to her name tape, before stopping at the rank on her shoulder. "Airman," he said loud enough for others to hear. "Not to confirm, but to define. To place her at the very bottom of this hangar." "You're in the wrong place." He took half a step closer, just enough for his presence to become pressure. "I'm calling security." The words came out like a routine. Line badge revoked. A brief pause. Incident report. Another beat. Unauthorized access to a restricted area. Each word stacked like a brick, not to uncover the truth, but to build a wall of authority in front of an audience. Around them, eyes began to shift. Someone let out a quiet chuckle, the half-smile of those who didn't want to get involved, but still wanted to stand with power. Others looked away, pretending to focus on unfinished work as if not seeing it might make it disappear. The silence was no longer neutral. It had chosen a side. She didn't react. No explanations. No soothing gestures. She stood straight, shoulders balanced, hands still stained with oil. The calm, instead of easing the situation, only unsettled the crew chief further. He was used to fear. Used to hurried apologies. Used to people stepping back the moment they heard the word security. But here there was none of that. "Did you hear me?" He snapped, his voice sharper now. "I'm giving you one last chance." That was how he framed it to himself, that he was being generous. That his authority was reasonable. That everything would be fine if the person in front of him would just bow her head. Then his eyes stopped. Not on her face, not on her rank, but on the small piece of fabric on her shoulder. A subdued patch, dark, simple, unadorned. The stitching wasn't large. The colors weren't bright. But it didn't resemble anything he was used to seeing on the perfectly regulated uniforms around this base. He narrowed his eyes as if he had found the proof he needed. "What's this?" His finger jabbed toward the patch. He didn't touch it, but he got close enough to violate the space. "Unauthorized patch." His voice slowed, stretching each word. "Where did you get this?" A short pause. "Online." A few scattered laughs followed. Not loud, not in unison, but sharp enough to sting. It was the laughter of safety, safe because they weren't the ones being targeted. She felt it the way she had felt it many times before in her life. Moments when honor was turned into entertainment simply because it didn't sit in the right place. That patch wasn't just fabric. It was memory. It was a promise. It was a name placed into her hands by someone who had survived. When that finger pointed at it, it wasn't just a regulation being questioned, it was an entire lifetime being dismissed. In that moment, she drew in a quiet breath. No one noticed. But inside her, a door opened. Not with words, but with the smell of hot metal. With ragged breathing. With the familiar sensation of standing at the thinnest line between life and death. The patch on her shoulder suddenly felt heavier, not from weight, but from memory. She still didn't speak. Not because she had nothing to say, but because there are things that don't need and shouldn't be explained to a crowd that isn't ready to listen. Her dignity didn't come from proving she deserved to be there. It came from having stood in places where every question became irrelevant. The crew chief interpreted her silence in his own way. He saw it as open defiance, as disrespect, as something that needed to be crushed before it spread. His voice rose another notch. "I'll say this again," he emphasized. "You are violating regulations." By now, the crowd was no longer completely innocent. Some stared at the patch a little longer. Others began to sense that something wasn't right. But no one spoke. Humiliation, once placed in the open, always spreads faster than courage. She stood there, surrounded by crossing glances, quiet laughter, and averted eyes. The patch on her shoulder didn't shine. It didn't demand attention. It was simply there, silent, enduring, just like her. And the moment it was labeled unauthorized, questioned in front of everyone, was the moment something deeper began to rise, not anger, but memory. As the insult landed, the silence around her was no longer empty. It began to fill with eyes that recognized something, and with someone at a distance who had just realized what was happening. The patch on her shoulder wasn't large. It wasn't brightly colored. It didn't look like something meant to draw attention. But to those who had truly walked through war, it didn't need to stand out to be recognized. A simple skull, a maroon beret pulled low, a short line of words carved like an oath that others may live. She felt the crew chief's gaze stop there, not because he understood, but because he believed he had just found the final violation. Yet for her, that moment opened something entirely different. Not anger, not shame, but memory. Just one breath. Very quiet. And then in her mind, the hangar vanished. In its place came the smell of scorched metal, the howl of wind beating hard, the familiar sensation of gloves soaked through with blood. There were no long images, only sharp fragments, a voice breaking over the radio, a hand gripping tight and refusing to let go, a promise never spoken aloud. The patch on her shoulder suddenly felt heavier, not from weight, but from what it carried. She straightened. The memory closed as quickly as it had come. She had learned that long ago. Memories were not allowed to linger because the mission always continued. And right now, her mission wasn't to tell her story. It was to hold her dignity in front of those who had never understood. At another corner of the hangar far from the confrontation, an older man had stopped without anyone noticing. A senior NCO. His shoulders bore the weight of many years of service. His hands carried the marks of time and real work. He didn't join the crowd. He didn't laugh. He didn't look away. He simply watched. And when his eyes landed on the patch on her shoulder, his body stilled just slightly. He knew that patch. Not from manuals, not from internal briefings, but from names spoken in lowered voices, from people who never fully told what they had done, from brief exchanges of recognition, eye contact instead of introductions. He had stood beside those who wore that symbol. He understood what it meant. And he understood that what was unfolding in front of him was no longer a disagreement over regulations. He looked back at the crew chief, at the way he stood, the way he spoke. The young confidence sliding steadily into overreach. Then he looked again at the woman standing at the nose of the A-10. The way she held her silence, the way she refused to lower herself to explain. All of it came together into a picture so clear, it sent a chill through him. He didn't step forward. He didn't intervene directly. He knew his role. And he knew this was the moment for a different level of responsibility. His hand slipped into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The movement was decisive. No hesitation. No drama. Just the certainty of someone who had seen enough to know when action was required. He raised the phone to his ear, his voice low, quick, precise. "Sir, we have a serious situation." A brief pause. "They're trying to remove a PJ from the flight line." No adjectives. No long explanation. He understood that using the correct designation was enough. On the other end of the line, the silence stretched longer than usual, a silence entirely different from the one filling the hangar. Meanwhile, the crew chief kept going. His voice rose higher, harder. Yet something had changed. Not in him, but in the space around him. Eyes that had turned away now lingered. Not out of fear, but recognition. Recognition that there were things that could not be labeled unauthorized by a careless glance. The woman remained still. The patch on her shoulder didn't move. It didn't need to. Its very presence had already triggered a chain of events that no one there could stop anymore. Power once contained within a raised voice began to shift. Slowly. Very slowly. But irreversibly. And somewhere beyond the sight of those gathered around the nose of the A-10, a decision had already been made. No one said it out loud, but from that moment on, this confrontation no longer belonged to the one who was shouting. It began to belong to those who were about to arrive. The crew chief waited for no further reaction. The silence in front of him had crossed his limit. He pulled out his phone, his voice hardening as he spoke quickly, like reciting a familiar procedure. "Call security." A brief pause. "We have an unauthorized person in a restricted area." He looked up at her, meeting her eyes. "You will leave the flight line immediately." The woman didn't answer. She didn't turn away. She didn't step forward. She remained exactly where she was, as if the decision had been made long ago and didn't need to change because of one more order. Her oil-stained hands relaxed at her sides. Her breathing was steady, her gaze unshaken. For her, this wasn't the first time cold words had pushed her to the edge. And she knew if she had to leave, she would leave in silence. But not because she was wrong. The air inside the hangar sank. The crowd grew still. No more murmurs. No more quiet laughter. Only eyes lingering longer than before. A few people began to sense that something wasn't right, even if they couldn't yet name it. Those who had been around long enough understood one thing: when a confrontation stretches this far without shouting what comes next is never small. The crew chief raised the phone to his ear, waiting for a response. His confidence was still there, but a small crack had appeared. Not fear, awareness, a sense that something around him was shifting, as if another current was forming silently, without his permission. Then the large doors at the far end of the hangar opened. No orders were given. No announcement was made. Just an arrival that made everyone turn at once. Decisive footsteps entered, neither rushed nor slow. Command staff. Faces that required no introduction. Ranks that made it immediately clear they hadn't come to ask questions. The crew chief lowered his phone, his hand stiffening. Color drained from his face. Every sentence he had prepared suddenly became useless. He snapped to attention by instinct, the movement awkward. No one was looking at him anymore. The senior commander walked straight through the crowd, without stopping, without glancing aside. His eyes were fixed on the woman standing at the nose of the A-10. No scrutiny. No doubt. Just recognition. A brief moment, yet enough to overturn the entire order of the hangar. He stopped in front of her at a measured distance. He didn't scold. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't ask a single question. He stood tall, moved with precision, and saluted her. A correct salute, no hesitation, no display. The hangar went completely still. "Please continue with your work, Sergeant." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Each word landed like an official seal. Not a defense. Not an apology, but recognition. Recognition that the person standing before him belonged here. That her presence required no justification. That every question asked before this moment had come too late. The woman returned the salute slowly. Clean, exact. Nothing added. Nothing withheld. "Yes, sir." Just 2 words. No excess emotion. No attempt to use the moment to say anything else. She turned back to the cannon, picked up the cleaning rod, and resumed the unfinished work, as if this had been the proper order all along. The silence spread again, no longer heavy with tension. It became something else. A silence of understanding. The crowd began to realize they had just witnessed something far beyond a dispute over regulations. Eyes that had once smirked now lowered. Those who had looked away straightened their posture. The crew chief stood there, and no one said a word to him. There was no need. The change had already happened, clearer than any reprimand. The authority that had moments ago rested in his voice had moved on quietly, without argument, to stand with the truth. The commander turned his gaze, sweeping across the crowd, slow, deliberate. No one met his eyes. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. There were things that needed to be said after this moment, and they were not meant for the one who had been shouting, but for those willing to listen. After that brief salute, no doubt remained only the truth, waiting to be spoken, clear and impossible to deny. The commander turned back, his voice calm and clear, needing no volume. "Let me be clear." He paused just long enough for everyone to focus. "The person standing before you is not an airman out of place." He looked straight at the crowd. "She is a PJ. Combat rescue." A few people froze. Some frowned, not yet grasping the full meaning. But those who had served long enough held their breath. That title required no long explanation. It carried its own weight, one that never appeared on shift rosters. "She is here under direct orders," the commander continued, his tone even without excess emotion. "Not to observe, not to inspect anyone, but to work." He gestured toward the GAU-8 cannon. "The very work you were just trying to stop." The commander didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. During a combat rescue mission, he said each word placed with precision. An A-10 pilot was shot down. A brief pause. She was the first to reach the ground. Another pause. She pulled that pilot out of the danger zone. One more beat. She kept him alive long enough for air support to arrive. The crowd fell silent. No one laughed anymore. No one looked away. Eyes began to change, not with fear, but with understanding. The patch on her shoulder. The commander continued, his voice lower now. "Is not decoration." He looked directly at the crew chief. It was given to her by the very A-10 pilot whose life she saved. One short sentence. He handed it to her himself. The woman stood still, neither confirming nor denying. She didn't need to. The story no longer belonged to her. It had been told the right way by the right person at the right time. As for why she's cleaning that cannon, the commander said, turning his gaze back to the GAU-8. It's very simple. He looked around the hangar. She wants to understand every component of this system. A pause. So that when another rescue team on the ground needs close air support, they never have to wonder whether that cannon will work. The words landed without emphasis, yet their impact was undeniable. Mechanics lowered their heads slightly, not because they had been reprimanded, but because they realized they were standing in the presence of someone carrying far more responsibility than they had imagined. The crew chief stood motionless. His earlier confidence had vanished. Not because he had been scolded, but because he understood. He understood that every word he had spoken, Airman unauthorized online purchase, had struck something far beyond his ability to judge. His face drained of color. His jaw tightened. His eyes could no longer meet anyone's. The commander didn't turn to reprimand him. He didn't have to. The truth had already done that work. No one here is being disciplined right now, he said firmly. We're here to clarify the facts. And the fact is, she belongs here. The atmosphere in the hangar shifted completely. No more tension. No more confrontation. Only awareness spreading slowly from one person to the next. Eyes that had once scrutinized her now held respect, not because of rank, but because of what she had done and why she was here. The woman gave a small nod as the commander finished. Not to accept credit, but to confirm the mission continued. She turned back to the cannon and placed her hand on the cold metal. The work wasn't finished. And to her, that was what mattered. The crew chief stood there with nothing left to say. No orders left to give. Only a vast space opening in his understanding, a space that forced him to look inward. And once the truth had been spoken, punishment became unnecessary, because what remained was not a mistake, but a lesson waiting to be learned. The commander turned to the crew chief. His voice neither loud nor harsh, yet sharp enough for every word to land exactly where it needed to. The duty of an NCO, he said slowly, is not only to protect assets or enforce regulations. A brief pause. It is to verify, to exercise restraint, and to lead people. The crew chief stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue. You saw a woman, the commander continued, and you reached a conclusion before seeking the truth. He paused. That is not a standard. That is bias. No one spoke. Those nearby understood this was not a public shaming. It was a reminder for everyone. A reminder that power, when separated from fairness, becomes something that damages the very unit it is meant to protect. The crew chief lowered his gaze. His shoulders dropped just slightly, not out of fear of punishment, but because for the first time he recognized the gap between believing he was right and actually being right, a gap he had never seen before. As the air grew heavy, the woman took a single step forward. Very small, but enough for everyone to see she was choosing to speak. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't rushed. It carried no self-defense. Sir, she said, turning to the commander, may I say something? He nodded, without hesitation. She turned to the crew chief. There was no anger in her eyes, no sense of victory, only the calm of someone who had stood at too many life-and-death crossroads to mistake what truly mattered. He did what he believed was right, she said. He wanted to protect the aircraft. He wanted to uphold the standard. The crew chief looked up, surprised, not because he was being defended, but because he had never expected to be seen that way. And I respect that she continued. We need crew chiefs with high standards. She paused. But standards are not tools for choosing people. Her voice grew lower, clearer. Standards apply to everyone. She spoke slowly, giving each word space to stand. The standard is the standard. Several people in the hangar held their breath. It doesn't have a gender. A brief pause. It doesn't have a rank. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a lecture. It was simply a truth spoken at the right moment. She didn't excuse what had happened. She didn't try to soften the consequences. She corrected the misalignment like a craftsman resetting a measuring tool before continuing the work. Never lower the standard, she said, looking directly at the crew chief. But don't let the standard be distorted by emotion or assumption. A quiet pause. We verify procedures. We don't judge people by appearances. The words fell without drama, yet left a long echo. The crew chief swallowed hard. His throat went dry. He bowed his head, not quickly, not under pressure, but slowly, like someone finally seeing a truth about himself he had long avoided. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. No excuses, no explanations, just 4 words heavy enough. "I was wrong," she nodded. A very small nod. Not forgiveness granted from above, but acknowledgement that the apology had been heard and that it was enough. "Learn from this," she said. "Then do better. No more, no less." The commander watched, choosing not to intervene further. The lesson didn't come from authority. It came from the one who had been wronged, and that was what gave it more weight than any formal punishment. The atmosphere in the hangar shifted once again. No confrontation, no tension. Only a deep settling. Those standing nearby understood they had witnessed something rare, a moment when power chose to listen and strength chose to lead through restraint. The crew chief lifted his head again. His eyes were different now. No defensiveness, no rivalry. Only the clarity of someone restored to his proper place within the chain of responsibility. And from that moment on, this story was no longer about a confrontation. It became something that would continue to live long after the woman had quietly moved on from this place. In the days that followed, the base no longer spoke of the incident as a side story. It became a marker. Quiet, but deep enough to force people to reconsider the way they looked at one another. A new training program was issued, concise, restrained, without theatrics. Its focus was clear, recognizing unconscious bias and the responsibility that comes with authority when confronting what one does not yet understand. No names were mentioned. No one was singled out. Only one consistent message remained before you judge verify. Verification procedures were updated as well. Short, practical, verify first. Those 3 words began appearing in briefings, internal documents, and everyday conversations. Not to make anyone's job harder, but to remind everyone that respect begins with asking the right questions at the right time. Seasoned mechanics started slowing down a beat when something seemed unfamiliar. No more quick glances that turned into conclusions. No more remarks driven by assumption. In their place came a new habit: pause, verify, then decide. The woman did not remain at the center of these changes. She did not appear in training sessions as a symbol. There were no speeches, no public thanks. She returned to her quiet role just as she had arrived. Continuing the work, continuing to observe, continuing to complete tasks few noticed, yet tasks whose absence would leave consequences no one could undo. To her, legacy was not about being named. It was about the system working better after she was gone. Months passed. One calm afternoon, in a place where service members came to measure themselves honestly, the crew chief appeared no longer hurried as before. His movements were slower, his focus steadier. He saw her there and stopped, not out of obligation, but choice. He stepped forward, stood straight, and spoke softly so no one else could hear. "I owe you an apology. No explanations, no excuses. 1 sentence complete." She nodded. "Not to close the old chapter, but to open something new." "Lower your point of aim slightly," she said, looking forward. "You're jerking the trigger." Her tone was even, as if explaining a simple technical detail. She didn't mention the hangar. She didn't mention the patch. She didn't mention that day. She focused only on what was in front of them, stance, breathing rhythm. The crew chief listened. Truly listened. No defensiveness. No distance. He followed her guidance step by step. His breathing steadied. His movements grew sure. When the string of fire ended, he turned to her, his eyes changed. No pride wounded, only gratitude. "Thank you," he said. 2 words this time unburdened by shame, carrying only maturity. She didn't stay long. She packed up neatly, left the way she always did. No one stood to see her off. No one called after her. But as she passed, the eyes that followed her were no longer curious or doubtful. They held quiet acknowledgement that some people serve an entire lifetime without needing their names known, and that some lessons only appear when we are humble enough to learn them. Small changes continued to spread. A different way of greeting. One more question before issuing an order. A brief pause before judgment. No one called it the legacy of any one person. Yet all of it traced back to a single moment handled with dignity when power chose to listen and strength chose to lead with fairness. Legacy is not a rank that makes others bow. Legacy is how we teach those who come after us to respect the right person at the right time. Veterans' legacy stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please share this video and subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.